Dave Kilcullen, thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about urbanization. What I want to do is really just to set the basic facts out there about African urbanization so that we can have a conversation amongst ourselves about the security implications of that. So, you know, the world is moving to the city. The planet is rapidly urbanizing, and I know you've had some discussion about that already. Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, is the fastest urbanizing continent on the planet. The population is currently 1.1 billion people, is expected to double by 2050. More than 80% of that roughly billion additional people in sub-Saharan Africa will be represented by urban growth. And again, the majority of that urban growth will be in slums, informal settlements, often on the outskirts of cities that are not necessarily serviced or provided with government presence. So this is an unprecedented urban transition, and the outcome of that transition really depends on leadership from African leaders. And there are two very different opinions about the possibilities for African urbanization. One is a very optimistic view, which says that the future of African political stability and economic growth really depends on urbanization and the associated industrialization that goes with that. There's another school of thought which suggests that rapid urban growth, particularly rapid unplanned urban growth, could be one of the most significant security challenges in the next generation, particularly in Africa. So to sort of set some more detail into the discussion, Africa is one of the last places on Earth to urbanize, and most of its urban growth has happened in the last 30 to 40 years. It hasn't received the attention that continents like Asia or Latin America have received. But in fact, the pace and scale of urban growth in Africa is dramatically higher now than in any other continent on the planet. Often the global discussion of urbanization focuses on megacities. Africa has three right now: Kinshasa, Cairo, and Lagos. But in fact, most rapid urban growth on the planet is happening in small and medium-sized cities, not in the biggest cities. And Africa is no exception to that. The regional growth rate in terms of cities across Africa is about 3%, but it's actually not the size of cities that matters so much. It's the pace of growth. So just to take a couple of examples, Antananarivo, the capital of Madagascar, is one of the continent's most fragile cities. Its urban population is growing at about 5.1% per annum. Abuja and Port Harcourt in Nigeria are growing at 6.2 and 5.1% respectively. Ouagadougou is growing at 7.2%, and Mukuda in Cameroon is the continent's fastest growing city at 7.8%. And so, putting that in context, the average urban growth across the planet is only about 1.8%. So we're looking at rates of urban growth that are between 5 and 7 times the pace of the rest of the planet. Urban growth is driven by a number of factors. There are pull factors and push factors. Pull factors are things that draw rural populations into the urban environment and increase fertility in cities, things like access to jobs, education, water, electricity, and in particular, connectivity, access to the internet, to cell phones, to satellite television, which has dramatically expanded in Africa in just the last decade or so. Push factors are things that are driving populations out of rural environments. Things like rural conflicts, drought, desertification, crime, poverty, things that encourage populations to depart from rural environments and end up in cities. The fast pace of growth in terms of urban growth as such in Africa is compounded by the youth bulge, particularly the high proportion of young people with very few job prospects in some urban areas in Africa. And that's seen by some analysts as a major risk for instability. So when you put all those factors together, many cities across Africa are actually suffering from a potentially combustible pattern of risks. It's very difficult to know the extent of urban insecurity without doing detailed study at the city level. The Brenthurst Foundation, based in Johannesburg, has just embarked on a study of 8 African cities, looking at cities across the entire continent for patterns and insights in terms of what security, economic and social actions might be taken at the city level and the national level to help ensure that the pattern of urbanization tips in a positive rather than a negative direction. There are also some references that I can give you in the discussion. A recent visualization of 300 African cities was produced by the Igarape Institute in Brazil and gives you a fairly good understanding at the city level of areas within each country that are experiencing a higher degree of fragility as a result of urban growth. But I should say that it's not all doom and gloom. In fact, there are a lot of cities that have demonstrated the ability to cope with rapid urban growth, usually by a combination of 3 critical elements, and I will leave you with this comment. The 3 critical elements that we've seen in most cases where cities have coped better with rapid urban growth are local level leadership, where people from within a community itself take charge of the effort to build a resilient community that can cope with rapid growth. The second element is technocratic expertise or technical expertise, often provided from outsiders, whether it be the national government or specialists who are not part of local conflicts, who can be seen as impartial and are able to bring a large N perspective, a perspective based on large numbers of examples to help local leaders make their own decisions about what the right way forward might be. And then the third critical element is providing a secure environment within which both locals and technical experts can think about how to deal with the problems that they're facing. If you can't provide people with a secure environment, it's almost impossible to get that kind of open, problem-solving thinking in place that's needed to deal with these kinds of challenges. So obviously there's a huge amount more to say about urbanization. I wrote a whole book about this a couple of years ago. I'm part of the Brenthurst Foundation's project, and many of us have been engaged in this for a number of years. But for the moment, I just want to leave it with those comments that Africa, urbanizing at the fastest rate that has been seen on the planet ever. The population will double by 2050. Most of that growth is in urban environments, particularly in slums, and that we're looking at growth in small and medium-sized cities in Africa that's between 5 and 7 times the pace of growth in the rest of the world. And dealing with that involves addressing both those push factors that cause people to leave the rural environment and move to cities, and managing the resiliency of cities in such a way that they're able to cope with rapid urban growth. So I'll stop there.